Hello and welcome back to Diddy on Trial from the BBC World Service with me, Anushka Matanda Dowity. Every week we bring you updates and deep dives into what's shaping up to be the trial of the decade. Sean Diddy Combs is being held in a New York jail on charges of racketeering with conspiracy, sex trafficking and transportation for prostitution. He denies them all. Today we're having a look at a question that we've been skirting around the edges of for a while. Does hip-hop have a problem? Is this a genre that makes excuses for bad behaviour, misogyny, sexual violence, and the over-sexualisation of young girls? Does that sound extreme? Listen to these lyrics. I'm trying to chase her, take her, date rape her. I stand outside the daycare, sit there and wait for her. This is from Rick Ross's song, UOENO. I put Molly in her champagne, she ain't even know it. I took her home and enjoyed that, she ain't even know it. Or what about this one? I can see that you're 15 years old. No, I don't want your ID. I can see that you're so far from home, but that's no hanging matter. It's no capital crime. I bet your mama doesn't know you scream like that. I bet your mother doesn't know you spit like that. You say you've got a friend that she's wilder than you. Why don't you bring her upstairs? If she's so wild, then she can join in too. That's actually a lyric from the song Stray Cat Blues by the Rolling Stones. So maybe this issue doesn't stay within the confines of one genre? Helping me unpack this today is Mark Anthony Neal, Professor of African and African American Studies at Duke University in North Carolina, and he also runs courses on the history of hip-hop, and Dr. Jason Rules, better known as Jay Rules, an Assistant Professor of Hip-Hop in the School of Music at The Ohio State University. He's also a musician, producer, and DJ. Hello both.
Hello, how are you?
Good,
How are you doing?
I'm going to start by saying that these critiques are nothing new, and this is nothing that sort of the trial of P. Diddy, the upcoming trial, it might have brought it to the surface of the media a little bit, but it didn't start, 2 months ago. When did we start to hear critiques of this, of hip hop? I'll start with you, Professor Neal.
I think we could go back at least 30 years ago to think about the case of Dr. Dre. When he was involved in a beatdown of a Black woman journalist, Dee Barnes. And while there was very little critical pushback that occurred outside the criminal justice system within hip hop, there were folks outside of hip hop who clearly were paying attention, among them Black feminists, who were writing and concerned about the kind of violence that was being directed towards Black girls that was embodied in this particular case with Dr. Dre.
That case was definitely something that was paid attention to. We also have to think about the rape trial of Tupac as well. There have been cases associated with hip hop, so it goes back, like you said, like Dr. Neal said, about at least 30 years.
One of the reasons people focus on it in particular, outside of things that happen, if we focus on the lyrics, when female sexuality is spoken about, sex with women is spoken about, it quite often utilizes aggressive language. Do you agree?
Yes, we don't hear language of tenderness and romance usually directed at, and I mean, it's kind of, we're joking about it at this moment, but I think that speaks to the larger issue of how young men in general process issues of sexual intimacy with women, how it's been introduced to them as young men, how it's been visualized to them, right? We talk about it in the context of hip hop, but what also are they seeing in the context of mainstream Hollywood film, what they're seeing in the context of pornography? That's all informing their frame in terms of how they think about what their sexual or intimate interactions with women should be.
But it's also something that female rappers have called out for a very, very long time. What have been some of the critiques leveled at hip hop by female rappers?
Right off the top was UNITY, the Queen Latifah song. I mean, this is not anything new. Female rappers have been talking about this for quite some time. I think it takes everyone to see that and to try to make that change. Not just the female rappers, but the males have to see that and understand that.
And I think what's also been a challenge for many women rappers, they're walking a fine line. In some ways they are packaging their own sexuality because it appeals to young men, right? Because it appeals to older men. So at the same time that they're pushing back at being objectified. Part of the industry, part of the business of being a woman rapper, particularly in the 90s and the early 2000s, right, is that you're presenting to them the very things that they seem to desire, even if what you're presenting to them as consumption is stuff that you might not be personally comfortable with. I feel the same way about some of the language. I don't think we spend enough time, we hear the lyrics. We very rarely actually have conversations with rappers about why did you choose these lyrics, right? And I wonder to the extent that they're actually invested. We could say the same thing about the violence that guns and drugs and all that kind of stuff. How invested the rappers are themselves in that language and the stories that they tell, as opposed to fitting some sort of rubric that they think they have to produce in order to sell records, right? And the pressure to sell records within that context.
So it kind of becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy because everyone's doing it, you do it as well.
Absolutely.
Definitely. And the business of music, is part of the blame. I mean, you got to understand it's about sales. And if you're not selling, you get dropped, as an artist. So there's a lot of pressure there. I mean, not that that's an excuse, but it's like it goes to the mindset of the more violent I can be, the more sales I get.
Mm-hmm.
We seem to have been having these discussions for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
So do you feel like anything's shifting? The conversation's moving forward? We're seeing progress? Because some of those lyrics I quoted are from 6 years ago and some of them are from 15, 20 years ago.
Progress, right? Maybe not so much, because I think it goes back to what I mentioned earlier about the business of music and what sells. If you look at social media and you notice what you see on social media, you may see some of the young ladies in social media scantily clad, can we say that? And they have hundreds of thousands of views. And it kind of goes to our society. We kind of go toward that. So as a rapper, I'm going to go toward what's going to get me the views or the sales. And so, the hypermasculinity is what's going to get me the sales. That keeps me on the label. That keeps me, doing shows and touring. So that's the mindset.
30 years ago, if you turned on mainstream Black radio, there's certain artists that you had to listen to, right? Because they were the only artists being played. The ecosystem now around music is so different, is that Big Sean can say what he wants and you never have to pay attention to it anymore, right? Because literally there are hundreds and thousands of other artists, some of them who are Black women who are openly feminist, some of them who are Black women and men who are openly queer, right, who are going to produce versions of hip hop music and rap music, popular music in general, that appeals to you, so that you do not have to be bombarded by these other kinds of images.
I just want to pick up on that. We're talking about like the diversification of hip hop there and the growth of the genre. When these think pieces are done about hip hop has an issue, hip hop has a sexism issue, hip hop has a misogyny issue, a sexual violence issue, and we don't talk about the genre sort of in its fullest and observe it from all different angles, it can feel a little bit uncomfortable. And I think because hip hop has functioned not just as a musical genre, but as a tool for civil rights and so for social justice in the USA, we have to appreciate that side of it as well. And I just want to pick up here a little bit on the positive side of the genre. Professor Neal, can you talk to me a little bit about what hip hop has done for the African American population?
And there's no question, from its earliest moments for Black youth, it was a conduit for them to talk about their own lives and their situations at a time where public policy and even Black political leadership was not paying much attention to them. You really do see a kind of two Black Americas that emerge in the 1980s, at least in terms of popular culture. There was a world of Cliff Huxtable and the Cosby Show that became a representation of what Black America was or should strive for. And at the same time, you have a generation, quote unquote, as William Jewis Wilson described it, the Black underclass, right, that is being framed in terms of criminality, in terms of fatherlessness, in all drug addiction and all those kinds of things. Hip hop allowed young Black people to tell their own stories on their own terms. And so it was important when it becomes politicized in very particular kinds of ways in the late 1980s because of groups like KRS-One and Boogie Down Productions, because of Public Enemy. And, even though some of the figures within NWA were problematic on for lots of reasons, you take a song like F the Police, right? It was really the first understanding for folks who did not live in the hood about the kind of ways in which the police force served as almost like an occupying force within Black communities. I think about Tiny T's Batarang, literally talking about this little machine that went through the hood in the mid-1980s, knocking down doors of houses because they assumed someone there was selling drugs. Hip hop gave that generation a voice. And if you go forward to 2008 and think about the election of Barack Obama, because hip hop was something that's crossed over, there were many 30 or 40-year-old white folks who looked at Barack Obama who were not afraid of a Black man being president because they had been listening to Big Daddy Kane and Eazy-E and Ice Cube for 20 years. So it's been important in that regard in terms of giving voice. It has not been as successful in terms of sustaining political movement. Right. We've seen moments where we've gotten, local folks elected and things like that. But, more than anything, it was a conduit for young Black folks to express themselves.
And I think that also picks up on another thing where we're talking about art as a reflection of your lived reality, because there is a conversation about the glamorization of violence, of street culture, hood culture, gang culture. Get the same thing in the UK, and people immediately come out and say, well, that is my lived experience and that is what I'm going to make my art about. I think also hip hop is continuing in a tradition of using music. It wasn't always hip hop, but the African American community in particular using music to voice their lived experience, but to also call for change. I mean, you could think of things like Strange Fruit. You could say things like the revolution will not be televised. There's tons of examples.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
However, I quoted those lyrics at the beginning, and those were just ones that I picked out from long lists. You've seen the think pieces. You've probably written think pieces on this and quoted the same things. Hip hop is so popular. It is so popular. It's a huge cultural export. It's the most listened to genre in the USA. Do we need to hold it more accountable? Yes, appreciating the good that it's done and appreciating the nuances around it and its position in the States, but saying, you are a cultural driving force now. You're not trying to break in, you're leading the way. So therefore you have to act right.
There's no question. You mentioned Strange Food and Gil Scott-Heron. We can add Public Enemy's Fight the Power, to that mix. Hip hop isn't producing Fight the Powers anymore. Fight the Power came from the perspective of folks in the music industry, wrote one who was speaking politically to young Black people, but for folks who saw themselves as outsiders in the music industry, right? Very few of the most prominent and successful artists now see themselves as outsiders. I would venture to say that they don't necessarily see themselves as representing hip hop. They're pop music stars, right? And they're treated as such. When I talk to my students, the 19 and 20-year-olds, about what hip hop is, right, and holding hip hop accountable, they're looking at me strangely, right? Because, I'll give a good example of where the industry is now. I mean, the Drake Kendrick Lamar thing, which drew so many eyeballs and attentiveness, right? And the fact that what it ultimately was an interpersonal beef, right? Imagine if that had been actually framed around what was happening politically in the country at the moment. If that was framed around what was happening in Gaza at this moment, right? That kind of energy is going towards the very things that the industry needs it to be framed around in order for the industry to keep moving forward. So hip hop for me at the moment is just a term. When we talk about contemporary artists, it's just a term that's used. It's pop music, things that made hip hop, that made us want to teach hip hop, right? In the case of Jason, in order to actually DJ and do things like that, those kind of things don't hold hip hop together anymore, right? So it's not surprising, right? As hip hop has become so corporate, it also has become so tone deaf to the kind of critiques that need to be made around accountability, whether it's about violence in the music or sexuality and misogyny, quite frankly, rape, narratives that circulate, in hip hop culture.
And that's such a great point, Dr. Neal. I think these things occurring, and hip hop is more of, as you said, corporate. It does feel corporate. However, there's still a burgeoning underground movement of folks who still love the culture. There's still people who are b-boying. There's still b-girls. There's still people that are DJing, DJ contests. There's still graph artists that are still
Mhm.
getting up all over. So there's people that still hold on to the culture, and that will eventually rise. That will come back, and that's kind of what we're hoping. But the mainstream of what hip hop has become, it's a business, and like I said earlier, it's the business of music. It's more the business aspect of it now.
Should we really be having conversations about hip hop and linking them to P. Diddy then? If you're talking about the sort of a pure essence of what it is and what it was created out of versus this mainstream, commercialized corporate culture that we have now, well, he was very central to sort of maneuvering that shift over. And I wouldn't I think not, I won't give my opinion. I would venture to say that a lot of reviewers, scholars, critics would not say that P. Diddy made the kind of music that was akin to Fight the Power. But maybe you disagree. But, should we really be talking about P. Diddy and hip hop in the same sentence? Or should we be talking about mainstream pop rap?
So you could have asked the question 25 years ago. What exactly is Sean Combs' skill set? What is he actually bringing to the table, right? He's not a good rapper, right? It was an ongoing narrative about the folks who worked in the studio, who did the producing, right? And he popped in and turned a knob here and turned a knob there and got a production credit, right? What Sean Combs was always at his best was hip hop's party starter. From his earliest days, that was his thing, right? He brought the party to hip hop. He was one of hip hop's best hype men. I mean, he was the hype man for the culture, and translated that into a brand that in many ways remains unmatched, right? There's no one, even in pop culture, I would argue, that represents what Sean Combs represented at his height as this kind of hype man brand. But when it comes down to the music, and other than his ability to recognize the talent of a Notorious B.I.G., and some of the early folks who signed on to Bad Boy really early, he was, I mean, even within hip hop, right? It was De La Soul who called Sean Combs in 1996, right? The shiny suit man. Right, that's who he was. He was a dude who showed up dancing in the shiny suits. Suge Knight's critique, right? Come to Death Row because you want to work with a producer that's going to produce you and not show up dancing in your videos. That's always who Diddy was, right? There was no art, to the Diddy production in that context, right? So I think in some ways it's unfair to collapse hip hop onto Diddy because Diddy was really his own thing.
Mhm. And let me add on. I think what Diddy did, because I mean we can't discount what Diddy did for hip hop culture, right?
Mhm.
He's part of the reason that it is a worldwide phenomenon, right?
Absolutely.
It's like these guys are promoters who turned what they did, as Dr. Neil said, into a brand and made it honestly transcend just hip hop culture, and it made it into something that became big and pop. um so I think that's what he brought. But when you talk about the culture and the main elements of hip hop, nobody's going to say, yo, Diddy did,
Mm.
that's not that representation.
You've given examples already of where those rappers have been linked to either lawsuits or rape claims, or also, lyrics that maybe glamorize rape culture. I was reading Catherine Russell Brown's piece the other day about black protectionism, and in this piece, she's saying there are still so few black idols that are allowed to make it to the position of mogul, that are allowed to have, you start generating things like generational wealth, put their kids in the position of CEOs, and kind of get glorified by the culture, that when one is threatened, even if they have done something wrong, the crimes are diminished and we look the other way. because so few have been allowed to reach the dizzying heights. Do you think that's part of the reason why there's not much will to hold people accountable for the lyrics? You know, you could stop turning up to shows, you could stop streaming the music, but people don't. Is it to protect those stars that have sort of made a name for themselves despite the odds? Professor Neil, I'll start with you.
We know the extent that folks went out of their way to protect, R. Kelly. R. Kelly's music continued to be played on Black radio for 15 years after the initial charges broke. Right. There's always been, and we could go back even deeper into Black political culture, going back 40 or 50 years of examples of folks who were problematic. But the Black community protected them because what they felt was more at stake was a diminishment of someone who had attained a certain level of notoriety and celebrity within the Black community, that taking them down would have an adverse effect on the Black community.
People are human. They're gonna do bad things. So we can't hold them up on a pedestal, even though some people will, like Dr. Neil said, some of the hardcore fans or what have you, they will, but people are human. They're gonna do things like that.
That was a really important conversation to have about holding people responsible for the actions of a whole genre or for the lyrics of somebody else. There are clearly issues, but these issues and lots of other people don't feel, and other artists working in the industry don't feel, are specific to hip hop. Working practices in music, studio sessions at 3 a.m, people being drunk or on drugs and getting dropped off at studio sessions, recruiting girls to go to studio sessions. That's not specific to hip hop. If I just cast an eye onto rock and roll and groupie culture, that has been going on for years and years and years. And groupie culture is very heavily linked to girls of school age. So looking forward, what do you think the changes need to be on the business side of things to help make this a safer environment for people? Jason, I'll start with you, because you're in the industry yourself.
Yeah, that's interesting. On the business side, changes should be made, and we could get into what they should be, but let's be real. Will they be made? The thing that I see when I'm in the industry and I see things similar, and I see groupie culture, that kind of thing occur, it's almost not encouraged, but kind of like, oh, we'll look this way and let it happen. And it's just something that happens. And like you said, it's not just in hip hop. I've seen it in a lot of different things, and not just in music. Comedy, actors, etc. Right? It's prevalent in anything that has a public eye on it. So when I think of it, it's not just music. I think it's a societal issue. It's something that has to change with our society. But how does that happen when, like I said earlier, you have social media and you have, people, and not just women, men do it as well, but who get attention based on their looks or their bodies or what they're wearing. So as a society, I think there's changes that need to happen.
I think it would be interesting to see, you mentioned acting just then. It would be interesting to see some of the protections from acting migrate into the music industry. You can have video vixens twerking up on the rapper in the music video, but I want to see an intimacy coordinator on set. And I don't think that is a standard practice. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that is.
No, it is not.
So maybe we should be looking to, practical measures like that. If we can't stop different people writing different lyrics, but can we shift things in the music industry to make it a little bit safer in hip hop and in other genres as well? Professor Neil, would you agree?
I absolutely would agree. And a lot of this ultimately, I think, boils down to the fact that, we have a gender problem, an anti-woman problem, an anti-trans problem, an anti-queer problem. And in many ways, our attention to hip hop around these questions is really an attempt to scapegoat hip hop, because it can be easily sent away. Right. It's a form of extraction that is almost extra to the industry, right? It doesn't help the industry move, but it's like the icing on the cake for the industry, right? And so it's expendable. in certain kinds of ways, right? And if hip hop disappears, yes, we got rid of our gender and sexuality problem, but the reality is that all the questions that we raise about how things function in the industry, speaks to the fact that if you are a young woman in American society, regardless of your industry, right? You could be an academic, you could be an undergraduate student, right? You could be a musician, you could be working in a factory in Amazon, right? You are dealing under particular kinds of conditions that allow for you to be exploited sexually, right, and violently in the context of your everyday lives, right? The fact that we have rappers who put language to this in music, just speaks to a kind of symbolic and surface aspect of what's happening more deeply in the context of the culture.
Thank you for speaking to me today. That was Mark Anthony Neal, Professor of African and American Studies at Duke University in North Carolina. Thank you. And Dr. Jason Rawls, or better known as Jay Rawls, an Assistant Professor of Hip Hop in the School of Music at Ohio State University. Thank you so much. Well, that's it from us today. I'm Anushka Matanda-Dawati, and you've been listening to Diddy on Trial from the BBC World Service. Make sure you subscribe to the BBC World Service YouTube channel so you never miss a thing. And keep sending us those questions on WhatsApp. You can find us at +44 330 123 551. That's +44 330 123 551.